Hi everyone, it's me. Welcome to I literally forget the month every single time. The October reading wrap up. I feel like I messed that up because on the day I'm filming this, like it's November 1st. So like my mind has already switched to November, but I have to remember that we're wrapping up October. So I have to like go back in time in my mind, but I'm rambling. Welcome to today's video. I first want to apologize in advance if I sound a little weird right now because I unfortunately am like a little bit sick right now. I'm just feeling a bit congested. I'm sniffling, I'm sneezing, I'm coughing a little bit. And so I feel like my voice has that like congested sound right now. If that is bothering you, I'm sorry. I apologize. Hopefully I'll feel better soon and I'll have a normal voice again. But what did we read in November? So I read 13 books in total, which is, I think, pretty average for me. That's like a pretty decent normal month. 5 of the books were fantasy or sci-fi. 3 of them were romance. 3 were historical fiction. 1 was a thriller, and there was 1 just like contemporary fiction in there. I also, before we get into the first book, just want to show you these cute little graphics from Fable. This video is not sponsored. I literally just signed up for Fable this past month, which was quite obviously long overdue because I realized Fable does these really cute graphics that summarize your month or your year or like just your current reading goal. And so it gave me this little cute October month of reading that shows you like what days you read what books. And I think that's just absolutely adorable. So that's the visual representation of what I read this month. And then also I just wanted to let you guys know I did create a book club on Fable. I know a bunch of you have been asking for one. So yeah, I did make a book club. This is basically mirroring my in-person Toronto local book club. So if you want to participate and you're not around Toronto but still want to read along with our book choices, join my Fable book club. There's going to be some fun discussion in there. I think the discussion is going to be like insane for this month specifically because our book choice for November is The Will of the Many by James Islington, which is actually a book I read in October, like 2 weeks ago. But yeah, our November book pick is The Will of the Many. It's so good. And I think the discussion, the theories, everything, like it's gonna be so good. So join my Fable book club. Again, not sponsored at all. I just made a Fable account. The link to my Fable book club will be in the description box below. So definitely check that out. Anyways, let's just get started with my first read of the month. We started this month with a nice, fun, light read because I can't remember what my last read in September was, but I remember at the beginning of this month just being like, I need something fun. Like I need something lighthearted and fun and something I can giggle at and like is not too serious. So I read Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston, which was, I think, so long overdue. I have wanted to read this book for so long. I've obviously heard so much about it because it's such a popular book and it's also been turned into a movie and everything. So I finally read it. If you don't know what this is, it is a contemporary romance, a queer contemporary romance, where we follow the American president's son and then a Prince of England. These two have been public rivals for a long time. Obviously, the Prince of England grew up in this like world of being a celebrity pretty much, like always being in the spotlight. And then we have our American president's son who did not grow up in the spotlight but is now obviously in the spotlight because he's sort of like become this influencer and then also wants to get into politics himself. So the two of them have always been rivals. From the first moment they met each other, they like just didn't get along. And so disaster strikes at the prince's brother's wedding at the beginning of the book. There's this whole fiasco with the wedding cake and everything, and it's a big mess. And so the two of them now have to like clear their names in the press and pretend to be friends, pose for some pictures, do some activities together to get the world off their backs. And so obviously it is a romance, so we get put into this forced proximity situation. It's really funny, it's really cute, it's really wholesome, and it has some more deeper meaning in there. But overall, I just found this to be super quick, super fun, and easy to read. I seriously think that this is one of the cutest books I have read in a very long time. The banter is just unbeatable because we're dealing with two people. They're forced proximity in the fact that they get like arranged to do these like friend dates together, but a lot of their relationship building is long distance because one of them obviously lives in the UK and one of them lives in the US. So we get like kind of letter writing, but it's modern day, so it's email writing. And I love reading like banter through letters or emails or texts. Like, I think it's just so cute. And yeah, I really like the romance. There was a lot of spice, which is something that I generally don't like, but I think the spice was like, I don't know, it was done well. There were a lot of like spicy scenes, but I think for the most part, they were honestly pretty fade to black. And so although I feel like a lot of the relationship was physical base, I didn't mind it here because I also think our characters bonded a lot like emotionally before they got into the physical contact. We do get into a little bit of real world politics in this book, obviously, like due to the nature of our characters being in those political worlds, but I think it was done really well. I don't know, sometimes, I think I talked to you guys about this in my last month's wrap up when I talked about Humor Me by Kat Shook. Sometimes when I'm reading a book and things get like too real world political, I get kind of triggered because I'm like, this book is supposed to be my safe space. It's supposed to be like taking me out of the real world, putting me in someone else's world. And sometimes when I feel like politics are brought into books, I get a little bit like turned off by that. But I think the way it was done in this book, it made sense why all of that political stuff was brought in, and I think it was done well. I think the ending of this book really dragged on. Like, I think the initial interaction and banter and stuff was so cute. I was literally like giggling out loud and laughing. I think the ending kind of dragged out. Like, it started to get a bit long, where I think certain parts could have been cut shorter. But overall, I really did love this book. I ended up just watching the Amazon movie adaptation right after reading it because I was just like, oh my god, this is so cute. I want to see this in person. I want to see it like embodied into actors and like on screen. So I watched the adaptation and it was a little bit different from the book. I found quite a few differences. There were certain characters that were just completely left out of the movie, and then some characters that didn't exist in the book were in the movie. So there were some changes. I think the overall like arc and the story stayed the same, but yeah, there were some changes in the movie that I didn't really like, because in the book I think we had this really cute found family vibe as well. There was this amazing like group of friends that I loved seeing them interact in the book, and I wanted to see that in the movie, but the found family part I think got kind of like cut in the movie pretty much entirely, so we could focus more on the romance in the movie, I guess. But yeah, I was missing that found family because I loved it so much in the book. That being said, the book was great. The movie was also really cute, and that was Red, White, and Royal Blue. I would highly recommend if you're looking for something that will make you giggle. Next up, you're really gonna see the mood reader in me because I read An Age of Winters by Gemma Liviero, which is a complete different vibe than Red, White, and Royal Blue. This is very much more of a serious, dark story. It's a historical fiction set in 1625 Franconia, like during the height of like witch trials. So in the prologue of this book, we set out this very sinister scene. We're in a small village and some very sinister things are starting to happen to children. Some of them start going missing. Some of them are like, their bodies are found in some very creepy ways. Something very bad is going on. Something terrible is happening. We're introduced to a reverend who shows up and is hired to like investigate what's going on. And this entire story is told through the POV of the reverend's maid, who is, I guess, our main character because that's who we see this story through. And things get really twisted. She starts getting this overwhelming obsession over the reverend and starts like fantasizing, falling in love with him and stuff, which is obviously like taboo. He's a reverend. And then our main character gets really jealous when a beautiful midwife also arrives in the village. And yeah, just things unfold. So I thought this book was great vibes for October, like perfect, spooky, witchy, historical vibe. I thought the story was interesting. It definitely captures like the true darkness of the witch trials and like what occurred in those times. But there was something about the writing style in this book that I couldn't get along with. Like, it felt like a book. I don't know if that will make sense, but sometimes I find when I'm reading books, some books when I'm reading them, the words fall away. I don't even realize I'm reading anymore. I'm just seeing things happen and like taking it in. Where some books, I am so overly aware of the words and the sentence structure. Like the fact that I'm reading a book is so evident that I can't get immersed in the story because the words are getting in the way, if that makes sense. I found that with this book. Like, it felt like someone was writing a story versus like someone was telling me a story, and it just felt really intuitive to follow. It felt like the narrator was just saying like, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, instead of like them just like truly experiencing these things as they happened. It was just like retelling, like reiterating a story. And so because of that, this book felt super long to read, even though it was like around 300 pages, I think. Like, it was not a long book, but to me it felt really long. Yeah, my overall thoughts about this one, I think the vibes were really good. If you're a vibes reader, this is great, especially if you're looking for that spooky theme. I know we're not in October anymore, but I feel like spooky theme can continue through to November. I couldn't get over the writing style. Okay, I then started my spooky reading video. So I do have a reading vlog reading the next 3 books. So I'm gonna try and whiz through these a little bit quicker. The first book I read was Starling House by Alix Harrow. This is a gothic fantasy set in a small town with a haunted house. We follow Opal, our FMC, who is not well off. It's just her and her brother. They're trying to make ends meet and just get through life and try and find a better place for them in the world. Opal has always been drawn to this house, this very haunted, mysterious house in their town called Starling House. This was the home to a reclusive author who passed away, but this author only wrote 1 book. It was a horror book, and Opal read it as a child, and it's always stuck with her since then. It's never left her mind, lives in her brain rent-free. Opal thinks about this house all the time because she wants to see inside of it, because she's like, I have grown up dreaming about this house and I want to see it. So she always like kind of walks up to it, and one day she walks right up to the fence and sees the heir, who is the only person who is surviving in the family, I think, and is the only person currently living there. He immediately tells her to run. He's like, what are you doing? Run away from this house, like warning her. And she runs, but for some reason she continues to be drawn into this house. She needs to know more. That is Starling House. I thought, again, vibes, perfect, immaculate for October especially. This is one of the books that I really enjoyed the setup of everything. So good. Like, up until the 50% mark, I was devouring, eating it up. But then for me, the story fell short. It was kind of like when I was reading Gallant by V.E. Schwab, where I loved the setup, loved the premise, but then the way things wrapped up didn't really satisfy me. With this book, Starling House in particular, I feel like there were 3 different storylines. Like, they were intertwined, but they, like, you could clearly divide the story into 3, and they were all happening simultaneously. And I feel like whenever we switched from like one part of the storyline to another part of the storyline, it felt like a complete different book. Like, the mood completely changed, the environment was completely different. I think because of that, I just felt a bit disjointed between all the storylines, and they didn't like come together as well as they should have in the end. So I think that kind of took me out of it. I also think there's a romance aspect in this book. I thought the romance was fine. I didn't care for it. I didn't get like so attached to it. It just kind of felt like it was there, which is fine because this book is not a romance. It is a gothic fantasy with a romance subplot. So the romance is not supposed to be like the main thing in the book, but to me, it was just kind of like there, could have done without it. But the writing in this book I really liked, with one thing that bugged me. One caveat is that this book used footnotes and I don't like footnotes when I'm reading books. I encountered this in the Emily Wilde series, where it made sense that there were footnotes because that series is supposed to be like an encyclopedia, like it's very academic themed. But in Starling House, I don't understand why we had to use footnotes. Obviously it was used to give more context behind things that were referenced in the book, but for me it's like, why put it like down at the bottom of the page? Why not just include it like in the main text, in the context of the book? Like, just incorporate it in there somehow. Because when I'm reading footnotes, I feel like I'm reading a textbook, and when I'm reading for fun, I don't want to feel like I'm reading a textbook. So that was one thing that bugged me, but other than that, I really liked the writing. But yeah, I think I just kind of lost interest in it by the end. But I would still recommend you giving it a try, especially if you want that sort of like gothic haunted house vibe. for October and November. I then wanted something more fast-paced. So I read 5 Survive by Holly Jackson, which was definitely guaranteed to be a fast-paced book because this book spans across the timeline of 8 hours. That's the entire book, just one night, 8 hours. This is a YA thriller. We follow a group of 6 teenagers as they go on this spring break trip. They borrow one of their like uncle's RVs when at like 10 p.m. I think 9 p.m. is when the book starts. The RV breaks down. They're in the middle of the woods. They're in a very remote place. They've all lost phone signal. And so they're like, what are we gonna do now? They start realizing that someone is after them. Someone has purposefully stopped their RV and they are now trapped in this RV because if they step out, it's not gonna end well. So we spend this night with these 6 teenagers trying to figure out who this person who is attacking them is, why they're attacking them, and it's really like time oriented. Like every section of the book is split into the hour. It's really fast paced, it's really fun. It's a Holly Jackson book, so the writing's like really easy to consume and devour. It immediately reminded me of something like Cabin in the Woods, probably because we have a friend group that's going out into the woods, obviously. I really enjoyed it because I think it was really refreshing for me. A lot of thrillers these days that I'm reading are about like our characters looking back into a crime that happened in the past. But I like how this thriller, like it was just, we were living in the moment. Like the crime was happening as we were in there. I really loved the hourly time splits too. I think it just forced Holly Jackson to keep the story going. Like something significant had to happen every hour, so there was no room for the story to drag. I think though when I was reading this book, I missed the perfect opportunity to read this during a 24-hour reading challenge where I read one chapter every hour, or not chapter, like section. Like I read one section every hour on that hour. Go through the night with the characters, so I'm like feeling the hour with them. Would have been really fun to experience. So I missed that opportunity. If you are gonna read this book, maybe try an all-nighter. Let me know how it goes if you do, because I think that would be so fun reading this that way. I think the ending though did disappoint me because it was just so exciting all the way through, and then the ending was just like it didn't wrap up the way I wanted it to. It left me a little bit unsatisfied, to be honest, but overall I think I really did enjoy this book. And then I read Fairy Tale by Stephen King, and this is the first Stephen King book I have ever read, so I'm kind of disappointed that I didn't like it, but I'm not gonna give up on Stephen King because I know that this book isn't like one of his normal books. It's not one of his like classics, and it's more of a fantasy versus a scary horror book. I don't know if I just wasn't in the mood for this one, but it really didn't hit for me. First of all, I wanted something horror and I read Fairy Tale, and that was probably a mistake on my part because you guys were all telling me that Fairy Tale is not actually scary. It's more of just a fantasy, but I normally like fantasy and I didn't really love this one. So Fairy Tale is about a teenager who inherits a house from an old man. Our teenager befriends this old man who is kind of like the weirdo of the neighborhood, starts taking care of him, and yet for some reason when the neighbor dies, he leaves the teenager his house. The kid, our main character, finds these cassette tapes that the old man has left behind, finds this whole portal thing to this other world, and that's Fairy Tale. As I mentioned, this book is not scary at all. It reads kind of more like a literary fiction, especially at the beginning of the book, which I actually really enjoyed the beginning of the book, even though it was not scary and it was not what I was in the mood for. I think the beginning of the book where we are setting the scene, seeing the relationships kind of build between this old man, the kid, and there's like a dog involved. I really liked it. It was really cute. It was wholesome. It felt like Up, like the Pixar Up. I think it's mainly because of the characters. Like literally there's an old man, there's a kid, and there's a dog. Like that's Up. And a weird house. But after that point, honestly, I think once we got into the fantasy aspect of it, I got bored. I was like, I'm not really feeling this fantasy world. It was just really long. It dragged on. Didn't care about the characters at that point. I was like, I want to just like go back to the real world. I was more interested in that side of the story over the fantasy part, which is really funny. So yeah, I don't know, that was Fairy Tale. I will say the writing was good. Like I can appreciate that the writing was good, but I think just the storytelling. But a lot of you have been recommending Pet Cemetery, Misery, and The Shining, I think, and The Outsider. I think those are the 4 most common Stephen King recs I've been getting from you guys, so I will do my best to obtain those books at some point in my life and try one of those as my continuation of Stephen King. I then read The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandanna, which was my book club's October pick. This is just a really like cozy Halloween themed romance. It's Halloween because it's witch based. We follow Mika Moon, who is a witch, but she's a witch in secret because in this world we're in a contemporary like modern day setting, but witches kind of have to stay secret because then they're going to be used for things. Everyone's going to want them to like fix their lives, cast spells for them, brew potions, whatever. So witches are secret in this modern day world, and Mika has to keep the fact that she's a witch a secret. There's this like monthly witch meeting where like a bunch of the witches get together and they just like update each other like, hey, I invented this new potion, hey, I invented this new spell, and they just like keep each other, they support each other because being a witch is like a very lonely life because you have to stay hidden all the time. So a lot of the time they can't have families or significant others because they would have to keep their witchiness a secret from them, and that makes things difficult. But Mika, our cheeky little main character, instead of like fully keeping her witchiness a secret, she poses as like a witch influencer where she is like pretending to be a witch and does like fake spells and fake potions. So she's like a witch hiding in plain sight because she's like, look, I'm a witch, but people don't know that she's actually witch. Her social media starts drawing attention from this house. There was a name for the house that I can't remember. Nowhere House? I think it's called Nowhere House. There are 3 young witches that want to be trained. The owner of this Nowhere House is like, hey Mika, I think you're actually a witch. I see your social media videos and I think you're not faking it. I think you're actually a witch and I want you to come to Nowhere House and teach these 3 witches how to be witches. So she goes, entertains the idea, and we get this really cute wholesome story of her bonding with these little cute witches, and then there's a romance in there. I think this book overall was just like, it was really cozy. It was like a nice cup of tea. The plot was simple. The romance to me was simple. I don't think anything like really resonated very like deeply within me, but I think it was just a cozy read for me. It was a casual, fun, cozy read, maybe a palate cleanser sort of a book for me. I think the coziness kind of was a bit detrimental to the plot of this book because we just focused on being cozy too much that the plot kind of fell off to the wayside. I would have loved to just to see more action. Not like a high action. I know this is like a low stakes cozy fantasy book, but I would have loved to see, for example, more lessons between Mika and the kids, like more bonding with the people of the house. Even the romance in this book I think kind of felt random to me when it started happening because the buildup of it, like we didn't spend a lot of time on it, I don't think. So when it did happen, I was like, whoa, that was very sudden. If you're looking for a really cute, wholesome, cozy book, I would highly recommend this one, but it's just very low stakes. Also, this book was like, it turned oddly spicy. There's one spice scene, but it's the type of book that like when I was reading it, I did not expect it to be spicy at all. I thought it was gonna be zero spice, absolute closed door because of how cozy everything was. And then all of a sudden we get to this like explicit smut scene and I was like, oh, that feels kind of out of place. But yeah, that was The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. Ooh, I then read If He Had Been With Me by Laura Nowlin. This book was sort of like, it was just like a sadness dump. It was one of those books that just dumps sadness on you. So we start off the book with a car crash. You know it's gonna be a sad book when the first scene is a car crash. So we start off the book knowing what happens, and then we rewind to chapter 1 where we then, get taken back to the beginning of the story and then start building our way up back to the car crash. It's very sad. Our main character in this book is the childhood friend of the victim, but their relationship is kind of complicated. She has kind of always been an outsider. She's never fit in. She's very like not like the other girls. But when she was younger, she bonded with Finn, who became her absolute best friend. He helped her through the lonely times. They just had each other. When all of a sudden they get to high school and then people change, people grow apart, so they became not really friends anymore, but they're still neighbors. They still have this kind of like childhood bond with each other. So yeah, the relationship is very complicated. We go through romances, breakups, friendships, things that teenagers go through. This book really felt like one of those indie teen movies. You know the type? I'm thinking, what is that one movie I'm thinking of in particular that this book like really felt like? It had Miley Cyrus in it. I think it was called like LOL or something like that. I watched it so long ago, but this book felt like that movie. Like that was the vibes of this book. It was kind of like indie, not like the other girls, rebellious teenagers trying to find themselves. And I am really in the middle of the road on this book. I didn't know what to rate it because there were parts of this book that I really loved and there were parts of this book that I really didn't like. So I ended up just giving it a 3-star because I don't know what to rate this book. I'm kind of at a loss. First of all, for me, it was kind of hard to connect to the main character because obviously I'm not a teenager, but I was a teenager at one point. But I just think that like my high school experience was so different from this high school experience. It was difficult for me to connect and relate. I also just think that the main character's voice was written very naive. Like when I was reading it, I know teenagers are young, but I think the way that this teenager was written, like she felt like younger than a teenager. I feel like her brain felt like it was 11, 12 years old when she was supposed to be like 17 in the story. I think I'm so over books where we have a romance where the two characters are like, I love each other so much. I've loved you my entire life, but they have never done anything about it and they just avoid each other for years. I'm so over that type of story. Unless it's in a fantasy and like our main characters are literally split because there's a whole world between them. Unless it's a situation like that, if it's a real world contemporary romance, I'm like, why are you just like living your entire life without telling the love of your life that you love them? I think I'm over that type of story at the moment. Maybe I'll be into them at some point again, but for now it's just not my cup of tea. So I was just kind of like over the romance part of this book. And then I think just like when I was reading this book, you already know that the story isn't going to end well, and you know there's going to be that car accident, and you know, like you just have this impending doom hovering above you the entire time you're reading this book, that like even when something positive happens in the book, you feel so bad about it. You're like, I don't want to get invested because I know that things are not gonna turn out well. Like I know how the story ends already. So it was hard to like continue reading knowing that this very sad thing was gonna happen. But I will say, even knowing all that, even saying all of that, I still felt so unbelievably touched and sad at the end of this book. It really, really hit me hard emotionally. This book did something right because I was so sad at the end. I think there were like really beautiful quotes to be pulled from this book. A story like this has so much potential. Like it's one of those stories that rips out your heartstrings. I don't know if the delivery of this book was my favorite, but obviously I still felt emotionally impacted at the end. So it was still good storytelling. Oh, and then there's also, I know there's another book that's not a sequel, but it is this same story, but written from like the other characters' POVs. And I've heard mixed things about that. I feel like some people prefer that one over this, and then some people are like, that one was disappointing. Knowing what I said about this book, let me know if you would recommend the other book, if you've read that one too, because I'm so torn. I really did like the story. I'm kind of like, I'm curious to see it from other POVs, so let me know. But the next book I read is our November book club fable book read. And that is The Will of the Many by James Islington, which was an immediate 5-star for me, so go pick it up. This is a fantasy sci-fi. We follow an orphan. He is a very low-ranking orphan, and so I'm gonna try not to like get so into the world building in this wrap up because I talked about it a lot in my vlog where I tried to read 5-star books. We have basically a world that is a sci-fi MLM that's based on power, and the power is called will. So we have a pyramid. We have a pyramid structure, a pyramid scheme, if you will. And at our base level, we have the octavists. This is the 8th ranking of people, the lowest ranking of people. And the octavists are always ceding their will to the 7th tier, which is Septimus. Will is basically life force. It's power, it's strength. The 8th tier is always giving their will to the 7th power, like feeding them. So they're powering the 7th tier people, and then the 7th tier people are powering 6th tier people, and then so on and so forth until we get to the top. So everyone is basically powering that one person at the top. That's where I get MLM vibes from. And so the people from each tier are basically exponentially as powerful as the people lower than them. Our main character, Vis, is an orphan at the beginning of the book. He lives in an orphanage, he works at a prison, he's very low ranking. When a higher ranking person comes, spots him, and he's like, hey, you're kind of smart. I kind of want to use you in my schemes. Things happen, and he eventually ends up at this elite academy. And he's sent there to become the top student, but also he's sent there to spy eye on certain people, and that is like such a basic version of trying to summarize this book, but it's so good. We get like elite academy vibes, we get this amazing world building, we get this huge crazy twist at the end that is still like, my brain is still reeling from it. So you need to read this book. The amount of theories that I have about like where the second book is going to take us and like things about the characters, it's insane. This world is just so layered, it's so well thought out. I had a lot of fun with this book. There's really good imagery, the writing is good. I will say I enjoyed the entire book, but the beginning of the book is a bit slower because we need to get all of that world building in. And so honestly, this book is kind of long. It's like 600 something pages. The first half of this book is very world building. The plot is not the quickest at the beginning of the book, but once you get to the halfway point, it really picks up. It really gets so good. And then that last chapter, you have to make it to that last chapter, because like I'm still like my mind, like I can't get this book off my mind. And the sequel comes out like next year in the summer, I think in June maybe. So we're gonna have to wait until then to see what happens. I'm not gonna say any more. There's high stakes, there's betrayals, there's deaths. Read this book. It's also the book club pick of November, so you have to read it. Then I read a much simpler book. This time it's real, by Liang. This is a contemporary romance. It's YA. It's also set at an elite school, but in a very different way, a very real world contemporary romance way. We follow Eliza, who writes an essay about her love life, basically. It becomes super viral after it gets published, and now she's kind of in a pickle because she has all of these, like, her top dream company to work for has offered her an internship to write for them, and she's getting all of these opportunities she's never had before. But she knows, deep down in her heart, she knows that her entire essay is a lie. It's false. She completely made it up. It's fiction. But now she's like, I have to kind of deal with this, because how am I going to go out to the world and be like, yeah guys, by the way, this entire essay about love and my experiences never happened to me. I made it all up. And so she makes this deal with this person at her school who is also like a celebrity. He's like a famous actor. She makes a deal with him. We go into this fake dating situation. It's a romance. I can't say anymore. I found this book to be obviously a lot more simple than The Will of the Many, but so well written. I love Liang's writing. You guys know I loved A Song to Drown Rivers so much when I read it earlier this year, and I can confirm I still love her writing. I was saying in my reading vlog when I read this that her writing really reminds me of Emily Henry, but for a younger audience. Her romance novels are not just romance, they also have like other life things going on, like friendships, family issues tied in there, which really reminds me of how Emily Henry writes her stories. I really loved it. It was simple, it was predictable, it was honestly a 4-star for me most of the way through the book until the end, and then it started tugging at my heartstrings and it became a 5-star. Again, really predictable, but I find with a lot of contemporary romances where the story is very predictable, it's all in the way that the story is written, like the way that we get to that romance, the way it's told, the structure of it. That's what really counts when you're reading a romance like this, and I thought it was just done perfectly here. I also just really loved how this book ties in Asian culture. So we're set in Beijing. It's an international school. I don't know, just small things about this book where like we're describing like the food that was on the dinner table and like snacks when we're like going out to get street food. All of it was just so Chinese, and I really loved that, because for me it just feels so comforting and nostalgic. It's like, yeah, those are things that I would see on my dinner table as a kid or as a teenager, and so I don't know, something about it just feels really good. So I love this book. Next up, I went right back over to a sad book. I read The Four Wings by Kristin Hanna. This is a historical fiction set in Texas during the Great Depression. So yeah, very sad, very Kristin Hanna. It was one of those kind of like slow moving slice of life but epic stories. In this one, we follow Elsa. She sees herself as a very below average woman. Like, she's never been considered beautiful. She's never been considered skilled or talented or smart. She's just kind of like fallen under the radar her entire life, and she lives with this. She grew up in this like sort of wealthy family, but she is now 25 years old and unmarried, which at the time was considered spinster age. So she's like, I need to just either give up on life or find someone, anyone to marry. She goes out one day against her parents' wishes, meets a guy, they get into some naughty business, and certain circumstances force the two of them to get married. So now they have to deal with being in this marriage, but like maybe not truly loving each other. She gets pretty much disowned by her own family, so she goes off to live with his parents. She tries to figure out this new way of life, but then the Great Depression hits, the big drought. We deal with natural disaster, bad economy, loss of job, families, loved ones breaking up, and it's another very sad story. I really love Kristin Hannah as an author, and I always love how all of her stories are sad, but I feel like a lot of her stories end up being bittersweet. There's beautiful moments in them, there's hope in them, there's always a good message behind everything. But I found in this book in particular, this was my least favorite Kristin Hannah so far, and I think it's because things started feeling really repetitive in the story. I think things dragged on because it just felt like the same things hitting our characters over and over and over again. And I think this book was very realistic in the way the story was told. And I know Kristin Hannah does a lot of research when she writes her books to make sure the experiences and the stories she's telling are very true to the experiences of people who really experience those events occurring in real life. And so I have no doubt that the story was very authentic to the real experience of being in Texas during the Great Depression. But as a story, as a book to read, it just felt like it dragged on, felt very monotonous, and I was very disappointed at the end of this book. I despised. That's a very strong word. I did not like the way that this book ended, but I still think this book was overall very good. It was Kristin Hannah, so the writing was amazing, and I think overall still a very good book, but I was just so mad by the end of this book that I could not give this book a 5-star. And I've given all of her other books either 5 or 4.5. And I truly love her as an author. Love all of her other books, but this I feel like was her weakest just because of the pacing of the story and yeah, what I was saying. Like everything just felt a bit monotonous. That was the 4 wins. Oh my gosh. Okay, then I read literally the most exciting book I've read this year. I received the ARC for the new V.E. Schwab release that's coming out in June of next year, I think, called Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil. I still cannot believe I got this arc because, as you guys know, V.E. Schwab is one of my favorite authors of all time. I love her writing. And so I was just so honored when I received this arc. I couldn't believe it. And so I immediately dove into it like the day after I received it. This is a sapphic vampire fantasy, like historical fantasy. Right off the bat, sounds so fun. We have 3 interconnected timelines that each involve a different woman and they're all interconnected. The years, hold on, I want to look up the actual numbers. The first timeline is 1532 in Santo Domingo in Spain. The second is in 1837 in London, and the third is 2019 in Boston. So we follow these 3 women in these different timelines, but they're very interconnected. They kind of flow into one big story. But yeah, we have sapphic vampires, we have toxic relationships, we have historical fiction. It's just so good. This book to me was like a love letter to Addie LaRue and Vicious. Like if Addie LaRue and Vicious had a baby, it would be this book, because I feel like overall the story, the pacing of it was very like Addie LaRue. We combine that with the morally gray or black characters of her Vicious series, like not those characters obviously, but like the vibe of those characters, and we get this book. We get this like toxic, villainous book that's told over the span of centuries, and I loved it. I devoured it. I ate it up. I think that V.E. Schwab just put her entire soul into this book. She actually, on Goodreads, rated her own book a 5-star, and she's like, I've never done this, but I need to rate this book a 5-star because I literally put my soul into it, and I think I deserve a 5-star rating. So I'm gonna read what she put on Goodreads here for you. After Addie, I swore I'd never put so much of my actual self into a book, and then I went and did this. Stripped down to my heart and bones and built a novel out of it. Everything I loved and everything I wanted and everything I feared. It's hard to process that one day some of you will read it too. I'd normally never give my own work stars, but given what it took to get down onto paper, I'm making an exception. I definitely felt that. Like when I was reading this book, I was like, I feel like this is V.E. Schwab's journal. Like this is just her soul spilling out into pages, and I was here for it because again, like I always say, I love her villains. Her villains are the strength in all of her books. In Addie LaRue, in Vicious, in Darker Shade of Magic, her villains are what makes her books so good. Like that's where her flavor is. And so whenever she writes these books that are just about villains, like the main characters are these like horrible villains, they just turn out so good. Like I no words. It's funny because when I was reading the premise of this book, I was expecting more of like a Wayward style of a story, because if you've read Wayward by Amelia Hart, the synopsis is, it sounds similar. It's like 3 timelines interconnected, but in Wayward it's witches and in this one it's vampires. I thought this would take more of a Wayward spin, but it really doesn't. The timelines are really much more connected, directly connected. In this book, Bury Our Bones, it's juicy, it's dark, it's just villainous. If you are a fan of V.E. Schwab, you need to read this book. You need to get your hands on this book. I still have my pre-order for this book because I received an e-arc and I want a signed copy from V.E. Schwab, so I'm still keeping my pre-order even though I've already read it. But yeah, this is just like a celebration of V.E. Schwab embodied into a book. Okay, we are at our last book for this month, and it was another historical fiction called A Place to Hide by Ronald H. Balson. This is set in World War II era. We follow a man and a woman at the beginning of the book who meet at a bakery. It's kind of like a random interaction, like it's they just bump into each other. They don't know each other, but they bump into each other, start talking. She tells him her like life story basically. She's a journalist, but she was split up from her family at a very young age and split up from her sister specifically, so she doesn't know where her sister is, has not seen her since she was like a very young child, and so she's kind of like always had this side quest to find her sister. And then the man that she's talking to is like, hey, I know someone who can help you and I can get you guys in touch. So she meets this other man. They make a trade where he will help her find her sister essentially, and then she will write down his life story because he has this interesting story that took place during World War II and he wants to document it in like a journal memoir type of a form so his family members can read it when he passes away. Right off the bat, I found this premise to be really interesting, but I think in terms of the execution, it was hard for me to immediately get into it because the first chapter is literally the scene where they meet each other in a bakery and start talking to each other. And for me, it just seemed really unrealistic for like this woman to be in a bakery, run into a man, I think her kid's like dropped a donut or something, and then for them to just be like, oh, I'm sorry, my kid dropped a donut on you. I'm gonna just tell you my life story immediately and we're just gonna help each other out. Maybe I'm cynical, but I'm like, that would never happen. Like I would never just run into some random stranger and then just start spilling my life story to them. But maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm just more of a closed off person. I don't know. But it was hard for me to believe that. Like it was just very unbelievable for me. But setting all that aside, I think the story was really interesting. Most of the story was spent on the man's like retelling of his life versus the woman's story of her finding her sister. His story is really interesting because he's an American, but he was sent to Amsterdam to work at the consulate there to help people like during the war get like visa immigration status to go over to the States. And so he was working in Amsterdam doing that, helping with refugees and stuff like that. So I've never read a book from that point of view, from that perspective, so I found that was interesting. I did learn a lot about that side of things, and I think a lot of the things that were happening in this book were also things that were happening in real life at that time. So I think this book was really well researched as well. But where the story was good, I think the storytelling, the writing was that style that felt like someone writing a book versus like something that felt natural. This book was very dialogue heavy because most of the book, like 99% of the book, was just this old man telling his story to the woman, and that was kind of a shame, to be honest, because I think the dialogue was the weakest part of the book in terms of the writing style, in my opinion at least. It felt very chunky. It felt very forced, not genuine. It didn't flow. It's just one of those dialogue styles that it's like people don't talk like that. Like people wouldn't say that. Like they would say it, but they would say it in a more natural way. I don't know. Very mixed again, very middle of the road on A Place to Hide, but I thought the story was interesting and I learned a lot. And I lied because there was one more book that I read this month, and it was The Bones Season by Samantha Shannon, which was actually the last book on my October TBR. So I successfully cleared out my entire October TBR. Go us, that's 2 months in a row where we read all the books that I picked from my TBR video. This is a sci-fi fantasy. It's the first in a series of 7 books. So it's a big one. So here I go off on another adventure, on another long series, but this is set in the Republic of Scion in like 2059, so it's still the future. Maybe we'll be there in 2059. Hopefully not, because it's kind of alarming. But Scion is actually London in the future, so it's kind of like if London was just evil and took over everything and created this very dystopian type of a world. We have a division of people. So we have humans that are humans, and then we have humans that are clairvoyants. So clairvoyants could be like oracles, mediums, our main character is a dream walker, like stuff like that. People who can talk to spirits and stuff, like kind of that otherworldly, psychic type of a human. And so in this world, we have a lot more of a divide between those people. The humans who are not clairvoyant are trying to stomp out the clairvoyants because they just think there's something evil about them, something unnatural, something wrong about them. And so our main character is a clairvoyant. She is a dream walker, which is like one of the most rare clairvoyants. We start off the book with her, and she's working in this crime syndicate, which is this whole underground network of clairvoyants who are just trying to stay alive and support each other. At the beginning of the book, our main character gets arrested because she ends up killing 2 like guards of the city, and so she gets arrested, sent to this divergent like dystopian society, and then we go from there. I'm not going to say anymore because I don't want to spoil things, but that's her book. It's one of those fantasies, like we're trying to overthrow the system. I really love this book. I thought it was a cool concept. I'm trying to like figure out what the vibes of this book was giving, and the first thing that comes to mind is Caraval, and this book is not Caraval at all. Like the story and the world are so different, but I think because we're in this like weird alternate world, and there's this whole thing where like our character only goes out at night, like the days are reversed, that really gave me Caraval vibes, because in Caraval it was the same thing, like you sleep during the day and go out at night, so things are reversed. It gave me kind of Caraval vibes. I don't know how else to describe it. I really enjoyed it. There is a bit of a romance subplot in there as well, which I was really into. I really liked. But there's one thing about Samantha Shannon books. So if you didn't know, this is the same author who wrote the Priory of the Orange Tree book, which is like that thick book. I feel like her or Bloomsbury, like together, they love making her books seem like bigger than they are, because the Bone season I don't think was that long, but the pages are so thick, the margins are so big, that I feel like they're trying to make her books seem longer than they actually are for some reason. Oh my gosh, we're back. I cannot believe I just filled my entire memory card. I've never done that before, so how much have I been yapping at you guys? Anyways, I just wanted to finish my final thoughts on the Bone season, and then we'll be done, I promise. I was saying that I think it's really interesting because this book was written 11 years ago, and then it was recently rewritten last year. And so Samantha Shannon released a 2023 version that is like apparently completely revised, completely like rewritten basically, but it tells the same general story just in a very different way and with some changes to details. I'm really curious to know like how different the book is. I know a lot of people are saying her writing has really improved over the years, so I think this like newest edition seems to be like miles better than the original from like my impression of reading things online. Yeah, I just find that really interesting that she literally rewrote basically her entire series. I think like books 1 to 4 she's rewritten and re-released. So if you've read the old Bone season and then read the new Bone season, let me know like what you think if you've read both of them and like compare and contrasted. Another thing I will have to say about Samantha Shannon in general is I feel like her worlds are sometimes like just a little bit unnecessarily complex. Like she likes to make up words. She likes to have a lot of new terminology in her worlds and names, and like I find it hard to like remember what everything is called in her books. Like same with Priory, and I think this applies more to Priory. I'll be reading the book and I'll be enjoying it. I'll be so into the story, and then I'll close the book and I'll try and think back on it, and I will not be able to remember like a single term, like what people's names were, what things were called. I just can't grasp in my mind the names of her things for some reason. Like we must just be on complete different wavelengths because her names for things don't stick to my head. I think the Bone season was easier though, because a lot of the terms were like real world terms or based on real world terms, like all the clairvoyant stuff. But yeah, there were still a lot of terms where I was like, what was that thing called? Or like, who was that person named? But other than that, I really enjoyed the story. Really excited to go on. I feel like I need to kind of like read this series quick, because if I take a long break between reading this and the next book, all of that terminology is gonna leave my head. And then I think the 5th book is coming out early next year. But yeah, that is the Bone season. There's also, okay, last thing, there is a 30-page glossary at the end of this book. That will just, that's your context in terms of like knowing how many different terms and names you have to remember. 30 pages, 30-page glossary. Okay, I'm really gonna end this video now because I've been yapping. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you liked this reading wrap up. If you did, please leave me a like and a comment. If you don't know what to comment down below, let me know what your favorite October read was. If you like me, subscribe, do that bell thing, and I will see you in the next one. Bye! Oh, and join my Fable book club.